Okay, we are recording, and we'll send out the link to everyone who registered in a day or so. We'll also send out a certificate of participation to those who are on the call with us this evening and who complete a brief survey. Those certificates we send out as email attachments, and they will go out next week shortly after the survey closes Monday. We reserve the microphone for the presenters. Everyone, if you called in, you are muted, and we ask you to interact with each other and with the presenters in the chat box. You're welcome to post questions and comments. We'll try to get back to you in the chat box in real time. When the presenter's not speaking, they'll be tending to the chat box. And if we're not able to, we might have a little time at the end, and if that doesn't work out, we'll get back to you individually, because we do get a transcript of the chat. And we'll be able to get back to you one to one. The presenters are Crystal Ahern, Peter Piccone, and Bonnie Belshi. They're all, as I mentioned, high school social studies teachers. You can read their bios in the webinar invitation, and I'll also put a link to that in the chat box. I'm going to be putting a lot of links in the chat box. The Gilded Age was a recent American Experience broadcast, and it introduces us to the titans and barons of the glittering late 19th century, whose materialistic extravagance contrasted sharply with the poverty of struggling workers. From the broadcast, WGBH Education has produced classroom resources made up of short clips from the program and support materials such as background essays, teaching tips, and discussion questions. And all of these materials are available on the site PBS LearningMedia. PBS LearningMedia is a co-production of GBH and PBS, and you'll find thousands of standards-aligned resources, again, such as short clips, lesson plans, interactive modules, etc., for grades K through 12, all subjects, but we are very strong in social studies. And the entire site is free. You are welcome to browse the site without signing in. If you sign in, again, it's free. And if you sign in, then you have full access to the functionality. You can download clips, etc. So we encourage you to sign into the site, but again, it is free. The Gilded Age resources that are on PBS Learning Media include 6 clips along with those support materials that I mentioned. And we start off with an introductory clip defining the era, then Coxey's Army, March on Washington, the Homestead Steel Strike, and the ideologies of a divided America that include Andrew Carnegie, Mary Elizabeth Lease, and Henry George. And links to those resources are in the document that you can upload, that you download. I uploaded it, I guess. You are downloading it in the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side under the chat box. So that's a link to a PDF document that has many links on it. You'll also have the survey link in that document, and I'll have the survey link on a screen towards the end of the presentation. All right, so I am going to turn it over to Crystal, who's going to kick it off. And after Crystal, Peter, and then Bonnie. And each of the teachers will be sharing their lesson ideas and also pointing out where it's appropriate or how they use the media. Okay? Crystal, you are on.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. And my name is Crystal Ahern, and I come from Dwyer Technology Academy in Elizabeth, New Jersey. We're a small, well, I shouldn't say small, we're a large urban school in northern New Jersey, and if you've ever been to Newark Airport, you've been to Elizabeth, because Newark Airport is actually in Elizabeth, and we are 2 miles from the airport, so you may have been close to us and you didn't even know it. So when we think about the Gilded Age, I often start with the quote by Mark Twain, because I think it characterizes the Gilded Age the best. It suggests that there's a glittering layer of prosperity that covered the poverty and corruption that existed in much of the society. And I tell my students to think about it as the coming of modern America, but that it needed reform. And when I ask them to think about the Gilded Age, I ask them to think about it in layers, or as many forces at work as the U.S. is beginning to grow into an industrial power. And when they think about it in layers, it takes the pressure off of it because there's so much going on in the Gilded Age. I have a number of different types of students that I deal with every day. And I know as educators, we encounter students with many different needs, and many times these students are in front of us all at the same time. I teach 3 different AP classes, as well as college prep history classes, and those classes include special education and ESL students. So teaching a complex subject like the Gilded Age can seem overwhelming when all of these different teaching strategies are available to meet the needs of all the students. So what I try to keep in mind is 3 things: the what of learning, the how of learning, and the why of learning. So I know that sounds pretty complicated, but you're probably already doing it without even realizing it. So the what of learning is the content, right? And so I use these techniques to help introduce students to new topics, such as the Gilded Age. In addition, these are good techniques for all learners, especially ESL and special education students, as ESL students would not have a background in American history because they did not attend elementary school in the United States, where many of our students are first introduced to American history. So using visuals helps them build a frame of reference. Also, these students may not understand the language, but they can understand a picture and they can make a connection with it. So the first picture that I show students is, it's not actually a picture, it's a map, right? So one way to help students make a personal connection is to have them review maps of the cities and the towns they live in. This is a map of Elizabeth, New Jersey from 1898. My students like this map in particular because they can find the streets they live on and they can see how Elizabeth has grown over the last 200 years. They also are able to identify the various factories that were built during the time. And 2 particular notable factories are the Singer Sewing Machine Company, which was a major employer well after the Great Depression. It is said that the company saved Elizabeth during the Depression because it remained open during the Depression. The other famous company was Standard Oil, which was located on the edge of town. They built a big refinery there. It's still there today, and it's known as ExxonMobil. And the students love thinking about that, and maybe Rockefeller was in Elizabeth, and that gives them a real connection to the time period. So this map is from the Library of Congress, which has a lot of great resources, but your local library may be able to help you find maps of your community in their archives. Our local library houses the archives and has been helpful in connecting our students to the history of Elizabeth. Okay, so these two photos are sort of my lead-off hitters when I talk about the Gilded Age. And they're great introductory photos to the Gilded Age because, you know, they're two drastically different scenes. And so now I'm going to open up the floor here and ask for a little bit of audience participation. In the chat box, you can respond. What do you think your students would say about these two photos?
There had never, ever been as rapid an
If we ask
economic
them to look at the
leap
differences
as took place in the United States.
About
In little more than a generation,
what they're actually doing in a photo.
this nation went from being a backwater to the leading industrial power in the world.
Okay, these are a lot of great responses.
30 years
Often
after
what
the
they
Civil
say.
War,
Interestingly
America
enough,
had
the family on
transformed
the left
into an
is,
economic powerhouse.
They're playing chess.
But the
and family on the right is
transformation
actually
had
rolling
created
cigars
stark
and
new
tennis.
divides in wealth, standing, and opportunity.
It's shocking
I'm gonna
for
let you guys
people
finish your
to see a
comments
country
before moving
developing
on.
before them that is increasingly clearly divided into the haves and have-nots.
Laura,
The
no
richest
one has ever
4,000
mentioned that about
families
his
in the
mother
country,
standing over
less than
his family and his
1%
other
of
mother
all
working.
Americans,
That is really
had
interesting.
scooped
Really
up
great
nearly as
observation.
much treasure as the other 11.6 million families combined.
A society which had prided itself on being
Wish we
a
had time to
nation
stay on
of
these photos,
small
but I'm
producers,
gonna
skilled
move on.
workers, farmers,
But anyway,
all
this is
roughly
great,
equal
like
in
I
their
said, for
social
ESL
position,
students
was no
and for
longer
AP
that.
students too
It
as
was
well. I know we have
overwhelmingly
a lot of
nation
AP
of
history
very
teachers here.
powerful,
And so
concentrated wealth on the
after
one
discussing
hand
the photos,
and wage
it's a good
labor
time
on
to
the
use
other,
the video defining the
suffering
Gilded Age
very serious
to help put the
dilemma
time period in
about how they
context for
would
students.
survive.
It was
This
a
is a way to
fractious
build a frame
time
of reference
in
for all
which
students
a
before diving
sense
into Gilded
of
Age content.
desperation
You can find this particular video
amidst
on PBS
growing
Learning as
wealth
well as the other videos
was
that will help
emerging.
students learn about the Gilded Age. So I'm going to play the video
Increasingly, workers begin to say, if I, as a member of this society, lack the ability to pay my bills and to feed my family, then I am not a free citizen of a healthy republic. I'm something else, something that the Founding Fathers would not recognize.
There is this fight over what is America's collective self-identity? Who are we? Are we two nations, the poor and the wealthy? Or are we one nation where everybody has a chance to succeed?
Okay, so I'm just going to click back to
Just click on the slides, Crystal. Yep.
Oh,
No, click on the slides.
okay. Oh, slides. Okay, sorry.
I got it.
Technical difficulties. I apologize.
Okay.
My fault. Okay. So I like that video. It introduces the kids to the dilemma faced by Americans during the period. And it's also a good starting off point to ask the students to think about issues that may have arisen during the period. So the next is the what of learning, and the Shark Tank idea actually came from a professional development group that I belong to on Facebook, the AP US History Facebook group, and also I think a World History Facebook group had it as well. And this idea was amazing. It has worked for my AP students and for my regular ed students, and they really embraced the activity and the creativity that they got to show in this activity. So in this stage of learning, students are planning and performing tasks, so they are building on their background knowledge. So as we all know, Shark Tank is a show where entrepreneurs go to seek a loan from an investor in exchange for a certain equity percentage of their company. So in this activity, students will be taking their background knowledge to the next level by researching the entrepreneurs and inventors from the time period. This activity requires them to understand why the inventions were important to the time period and why people might invest in them. In this Gilded Age Shark Tank, you'll have inventors and entrepreneurs who are vying for the title of the greatest invention of the Gilded Age. That's my twist to it. It's trying to help the students think about the impact of these inventions. So you're going to select a few students to be the Shark Tank members who decide which invention most impacted the country. And then the rest of the class, they are the inventors, so the Bessemer process, the zipper, the elevator. The kids love arguing about the zipper, believe it or not. And they're seeking the title of the greatest Gilded Age invention from the Shark Tank. One other twist that I have put onto this activity is to ask the students to solve the problems created by industrialization during the period. So that asks them to think about the effects of industrialization, which is really important because that industrialization, as good as it was for the country, it caused many of the problems. Okay. The next stage of learning is the why of learning, and it's very much connected to the how of learning. And as history teachers, we deal with this on a daily basis. How often do we hear history is boring or it doesn't affect me? And so what I like to do is to use political cartoons to connect them to the past. Before I would show the political cartoons, I would probably show this clip from Progress and Poverty that PBS has on Henry George's book from that time period. I wish I had time to show it to you guys, but I cannot take time away from Peter and Bonnie, so I'm not going to show it to you, but I highly suggest that you take a look at this video because it really captures the essence of the period and the problems that people, average, everyday Americans were facing. So on to the political cartoons. So these two political cartoons, the one on the right should be pretty familiar to you. It was in Puck in 1889. And the cartoon on the left is from 2010. And this particular artist, John Darkow, he won the Pulitzer Prize for editorial cartooning during the period. So essentially, both cartoons are expressing the idea that corporations are dictating conditions to the government, and this would be a great time to talk about historical context and how the cartoons reflect the larger historical processes that are taking place during the period. And to help the students analyze the documents, I use the HIP strategy. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. But what I do is I have a worksheet, and they each HIP the documents, and then they do a compare and contrast of these two particular political cartoons. So it really allows them to dig into the document, but it's not intimidating. And I do this with not only the AP students, but with my college prep students as well. They can do this work too. Sometimes they need a little bit more extra time, but they certainly can do it. And so these are the tipping strategies that I use with the students. And I like this particular strategy to really dig into the historical context and what was going on in the time period that would cause the creation of this particular cartoon or document. So with that being said, I don't want to take up too much more time. I'm going to hand the presentation over to Peter. He's got some really great stuff to show you guys.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Yeah, Peter, excuse me 1 second before we move on. Thank you. Thank you, Crystal. I just want to call your attention, Crystal, to the chat box. There were several questions in there that you might be able to comment on. And also, people are very impressed with your activity. And so if there's a way that we can make available to them more details or any other materials you have, we'll include links to that later on. Okay? Thank you.
Yeah,
all right,
yes,
Peter.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let me start off. Hello, everybody, and a Happy New Year to you, wherever you may be. It's still January. I get to say that. Great honor and privilege to be here with you tonight and to be given this chance to share with you how I incorporate these 7 American Experience Gilded Age videos into my San Marino High School AP US History class. First, though, before I get to that, I want to talk a bit about my school. San Marino High School is a relatively small and yet at the same time nationally acclaimed 9th through 12th grade public school located about 20 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles. It's also located just off of a street named after Henry E. Huntington. That's the nephew of one of America's most famous Gilded Age railroad magnates, Collis P. Huntington. This year, I'm teaching 5 periods of U.S. history, and to get each of my 130 students or so ready to answer any and all of the Gilded Age-related questions appearing on the annual APUSH exam, the first thing that I do is I look to what's called the Key Concept 623 of the AP U.S. History course.
Frick circled the 600-acre factory grounds with a fence, water cannons, and sniper towers that gave Homestead the look and feel of an armed garrison. The steelworkers would not be intimidated and refused to accept the proposed wage cuts. Frick shuttered the plant and put a stop to the company payroll.
Getting my students to know
Union men went on strike and threatened to block any replacements from entering the mill. On July 6, 1892, under the cover of darkness, Frick shipped a 300-man private security force to protect the non-union replacement workers. When the barge carrying the armed guards arrived, Homestead's union employees were there waiting for them, guns in hand. After a prolonged firefight, the strikers used explosives in an attempt to blow up the barge. At least 16 people were killed and more than 150 injured in the battle that followed.
I actually found this pretty valuable. I then provide my students with some much
Carnegie refused to back down.
From the background readings that are also attached to the
Stand firm, he telegraphed Frick from Scotland.
And then I show several
Must not
of
fail
these
now.
videos, my favorite one being the one entitled The Home
It took 5 months,
Strike.
but Carnegie
5
did
minutes
crush the
and 43
union at
seconds
Homestead,
long, with the best part
with
of it
plenty of help
starting
from
off
state officials.
3 minutes in and describing how
When the
plant
company asked the
manager
governor
Henry
of
Frick
Pennsylvania to
circled
send
the
in
factory
National
grounds
Guard
with
troops
fence, water
to shore up
cannons,
its tattered
sniper
private
towers,
army,
they gave the Homestead
he dispatched
steel
a
plant
force
the
of
look and feel
8,500
of an
soldiers
armed
to put down the
garrison.
strike.
I'm now going to run that
Carnegie
clip
also
for you.
knew he could count on the federal government if needed. The president sent in troops to put down a similar strike at silver mines in Idaho that same week.
One of the big questions is, whose business is it? Is it Carnegie's business, and does he get to make all the decisions, or do workers have a place in that business too? And that's kind of an open question, and government ends up really coming out on the side of the guy who owns the property rather than the people who do the work.
Okay. Bring that back, the slides. When I'm finished showing this video and the other 6 that make up this collection, I require my students to write what I call a historical fiction letter. A 750 to 1,000 word letter addressed to the class and describing the content of one of the videos as told from the perspective of someone who was there to experience it, with the student letter writer assuming that he or she was between the age of 18 to 25 when writing the letter. A great example of a historical fiction letter applied to the Homestead strike video was produced this year by Austin N. In his historical fiction letter, Austin assumed that he was one of 3,800 workers who had participated in the strike, and that he was writing his letter in the late evening hours of July 6, 1892, on the very day that Frick deployed the Pinkerton Guards to put down the strike. In Jordan M.'s historical fiction letter, Jordan assumed that she was the wife of a striking Homestead steel plant worker. Jordan also assumed that she wrote her letter 2 days after her husband had been shot in the leg by the Pinkerton Guards storming the steel plant. Another great letter was produced by Connor S. In his historical fiction letter, Connor assumed that he was an Idaho copper mine owner who, following Andrew Carnegie's lead, also provided his worker with a town consisting of homes, schools, and churches. Connor also assumed that he wrote his letter shortly after having learned from a local newspaper how Carnegie and Frick had put down the striking Homestead workers. What I really liked about this one is that Connor, before writing this letter, this is California, Southern California, Connor came up to me and he said something along the lines of, hey, maybe this is liberal California, but I really don't buy into all of this concern for these workers. I have a different point of view when it comes how to run a business, and that's, of course, why he wrote from that perspective. Last but not least, one of my all-time favorite letters this year was one written by a girl named Jun Yi, with Jun Yi assuming in her letter that she was one of Andrew Carnegie's Chinese housemaids and someone who had prided herself in keeping Carnegie's Pittsburgh mansion cleaned to the highest standards during the Homestead strike. Jun Yi, writing is not her strength, and yet what came through so wonderfully in this letter was Jun Yi claiming in the letter, assuming this letter, that she had heard about the strikers, felt a sympathy towards the strikers, yet on the same hand felt grateful to Carnegie for having given her this opportunity to work in this home, yet she struggled with thoughts about how could the workers, strikers, myself have so little, Carnegie have so much. And despite the language issues, she really conveyed some wonderful thoughts there. Best part of that one I also liked was that she argued that, or at least put forward, that she was a descendant of a Chinese gold miner who had struck it rich and moved to Pittsburgh. If you're interested in taking a close look at each of the 5 letters that I've just described, I suggest you check out the link found here. This link will also provide you with access to many other good historical fiction letters that my students have produced, and not just for the Homestead Steel Strike, but for the other videos as well. Coxey's Army March, George's book, and so on. Even if you don't plan on having your students write any historical fiction letters of their own, I strongly encourage you to have your students read some of the letters my students have written, if only for you or for your students to reinforce some of the all-important content that they're required to learn. Failing that, I can't encourage you strongly enough to show your students each of these 7 videos. I believe, my opinion, I think my students' opinion, they were all very, very well done, and I think they should prove of great value to your students, push or otherwise. I would love to, finally, just in closing, I would love to hear if you go down this path, I'd love to see examples of some of your students' work, and feel free to email me or contact me on Twitter. I would love to keep this connection going. Thanks for the opportunity to chat with you tonight.
Great. Peter and Carolyn, do you want to put your contact information in the chat box?
Will do.
Great. And presenters, you are doing such a wonderful job on keeping to time that we can take a pause and make sure that we're attending to the chat box. And we're going to have time at the end for more Q&A and conversation, so the presenters, you can think about other questions you might want to ask the group or vice versa. Okay, we can go to Bonnie now.
Carolyn, if we have just a second, I would love to see if there's some teachers with the Homestead strike, what would be their, what they would write from. Just if they could just put that into the box from what perspective they would write from, and if they want to make a suggestion or two.
Absolutely. Go right ahead. Do you want to pose the question and put the question in the chat box, and then
yeah,
we'll see
we'll
what
do.
happens?
Sure. We'll do.
Great. Let's give this a couple of minutes, Bonnie, and then you start whenever you're ready.
Sounds fantastic. I'm seeing some great ideas that people are putting here about their letters and who they would write and what they would want to look at. I have a feeling I would have been one of the muckrakers, knowing me, knowing how I think and how I work. That's I think what I would want to look at. These are absolutely fantastic. Family member of strike worker, Frick's perspective, striker, strike breaker, some really interesting ones that we have going on here. I definitely love seeing all of this. It's one of the great things about these webinars is the creativity that we can share with each other. Love this. So I'm going to get started. As I said, my name is Bonnie Belshi. I am in Cupertino, California. I teach at Monte Vista High School, so we are right in the heart of Silicon Valley. We've got about 2,500 students at our school. The vast majority, 95% or more, go on to college every year. Most have parents with college degrees, advanced degrees, but they have come in mind with a STEM focus, and they really think like that's what they're interested in. They're all going to be engineers. And so my role is getting them excited about history, but also seeing how the skills of being a historian can connect to the other classes that they have and how we can really pull all of those together. So what I'm going to talk to you about is a little different than what Crystal and Peter are doing, and they have some fantastic ideas that I'm very excited to now take those and use them in my classroom. But I want to look at with you today how I frame looking at the Gilded Age. And I do that by not calling it, in fact, the Gilded Age. I look at the larger rise of industrial America and pair the Gilded Age and progressive era together. So I don't separate those. First thing with this, I think it's really important for students, and this is for both my APUSH students and my U.S. history students, so college prep and APUSH. I want them to be historians. I want them talking like they are historians, reading, writing, arguing with each other, and we know historians love to argue with one another. So with that, I think it's really important that they understand historiography. And I am putting right now in the chat box, I'm just going to pause here for a second, a link to a Google folder. If anyone with a link can access this, I've got a little more information about historiography that is up there, some other links, and I'll continue to put up some resources that are connected with this. So just real briefly on some of these key pieces is that the historiography is how historians have written about history. I think it's really important that we put the historian back into the study of history. So this is connecting the historians with primary sources, connecting the historians with their own time period and how that shapes how they learn and write about the history. So this era we would call the Gilded Age, that's scientific historiography. So that's based on trying to apply the scientific method to the study of history, using social Darwinism, seeing imperialism. That will then give way, at the turn of the 20th century, to progressive historiography, which gets the name from the progressive era. So the progressive historians look at internal conflict, class consciousness, class conflict. And then we'll go into consensus historiography, sort of an us versus them during the Cold War, to where we are currently, which is known as New Left historiography. We really don't have anything
one of the most innovative entrepreneurs of the day was Andrew Carnegie.
Cap classifications. So these are just looking at the broad categories. This is not
like
looking
John
at
D.
any
Rockefeller in the
one
oil refining business,
part,
and Cornelius
here.
Vanderbilt in railroads.
So for the Gilded Age,
Carnegie was riding a
historian
wave of
Al Lefkoff
industrialization,
has done some great work
using new technology
looking at how
and
the
mass
Gilded Age
production
as a term
to secure
was
enormous
popularized
personal wealth.
by the progressive historians in the 1920s.
His long-ago search
When
to
I'm
understand
teaching my
his own
students,
spectacular
I actually
success
start
had made him a
our
true
era
believer
of
in the
the rise
philosophy of
industrial
Herbert
America
Spencer.
with the question of, do we have two eras here of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, or do we put them under the umbrella? So I want them thinking about that from the very beginning. Because the purpose of the Gilded Age term, and we've just been having this conversation with each other today, it's an indictment of the elite. But what that does is it misses some of the reform movements, the complexity, the social movements. Gilded Age is very much a focus on capital,
Voices of
versus
protest
labor,
on the hot, dry prairie
corporations and
was a
corruption
39-year-old former
versus
school
when we talk
teacher
about
and
progressive
licensed
era.
attorney
Think of
named Mary
Teddy
Elizabeth
Roosevelt,
Lease.
and optimism and change.
She was
And
an
really,
energetic
there's a lot
agitator
of
who made a
crossover
living giving
between
speeches
them
in
for how
support
we
of
look at it.
underdogs, labor unionists, suffragettes, and in the summer of 1890,
And so there are a
the
couple
Kansas
of,
farmer.
I think, great clips that we've been seeing, and two of the ones that I want to highlight are within that ideologies of a divided America. So the first one for looking at Andrew Carnegie, who's very much kind of the classic Gilded Age that we look at, this idea of, is it robber baron, the rise of philanthropy, and kind of how they're tied together. So I'm going to play just a part of this clip. Let me just pull that up here. So it is a fantastic clip. Unfortunately, we don't have time to show all of it, but I encourage all of you to go and listen and watch all of these. They're so incredibly accessible for our students. I want to play, paired with this, another one of the ideology clips is looking at Mary Lease and the populist movement. So that clip just in the very beginning, and it's fantastic. And thank you, Carolyn, for putting the times. Yes, these are short, accessible clips. But already in this clip, what we have seen is that there's a little more complication to looking at the Gilded Age than just kind of our question of captains of industry or robber barons. So I love looking at these two clips together with students because it immediately brings to mind this fantastic quotation from historian Elizabeth Israels Perry. She said that men are from the Gilded Age, women are from the Progressive Era. I absolutely love this one, and I love bringing this up with students at the beginning of this kind of what I call the rise of industrial America to get them thinking about how historians play this role and how we even define the history we're looking at. And so I pose the question kind of continually throughout this study of this era for my students, what has been the effect of the study of women's history on how I'm teaching them about the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, about questions that we have and they might be interested in, how they look at this. So I absolutely love this quote here. And for students, it really kind of gets a lot of them to kind of sit up and kind of think about what we're looking at and these questions that we have. Because the women of the Gilded Age are also the women of the Progressive Era. But the textbooks very much have a tendency to just look at women on one end and not really the role that women have during the Gilded Age with our captains of industry. So Jane Addams and the founding of Hull House, this is very much in the Gilded Age. Florence Kelley going in and getting her start in Hull House and her work is very much founded in the Gilded Age with the National Consumers League. But we tend to not talk about these women in the Gilded Age. And so what I want to do with them, just kind of encourage you today, is to put the women back into the Gilded Age, because with that, I really think it helps to connect to the Progressive Era more, because the reform movements that we call the reform movements of the Gilded Age, like looking at suffrage, and here we've got with the battle axe, Carrie Nation and her battle axe, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. These are very much started key pieces of reform movements from the Gilded Age. And so they are very tied together that we have with these. So I really like looking at kind of how they're both prominent movements in the 1870s. And I see some other people are putting in other women of the Gilded Age and connecting them, and I absolutely love that. If you've got more, keep putting them in the chat box. The more that we can get women's history out there, the richer, fuller story that we're telling for all of our students. So I love using historian Rebecca Edwards, who we saw actually in the Homestead Strike clip. She was the historian from the clip that Peter showed. She has done a lot of work on what other historians refer to as the Gilded Age. She always uses it in quotations because she really looks at the Gilded Age as part of this larger era. So what I like to do with my students, and I do this with both my regular U.S. history and AP U.S. history, is to get them to look at short historical interpretations, but really do the deep dive into them. I am a little more of a Light-Out. I have it just printed on paper for them. I give them markers or pens of different colors, but each one has a different theme, different focus they're looking at. So they will mark down their notes on what is the historian's claim. So for Rebecca Edwards, looking at how Gilded Age might not be a useful, accurate term. What is then the evidence that the historian uses in their writing? What is, key vocabulary, either that they don't understand or they need to know to look at it. So in this, a student might not know what marginalized means. They might need to have declension defined. And then versus what is the context of what they're looking at. So I love looking at this one here. So Rebecca Edwards has done some really great work about expanding how historians look at the Gilded Age. So she's done some great work for looking at, Chinese immigrants during this time of what's supposed to be Chinese exclusion. And these short historical interpretations fit so well with looking at the short video clips. So they're both hearing and seeing the historians as well as reading their words that they have. And so here's another one that I would pair it with, this one from historian Jeffrey Blodgett. So this is from 1974. This is a much earlier piece. And he says at the bottom there that the age has remained for many a vast gray zone, monotonous, inconclusive, an era of evasion, avoidance, and postponement, glazed over with the mix of flamboyant rhetoric and sterile purposes. And so I would, as students are looking at this and comparing their interpretations, do they feel that one has a little more historical weight? What is the evidence that they have? And we could find evidence to fit for both of them. If we're perhaps focusing on the men of the Gilded Age, this idea of the sterile purposes, evasion, avoidance, might read a little more true to them versus if we add in more for women. And I see so many people adding particularly Ida B. Wells. Love her, absolutely. Key piece with this. So if we look at Jane Addams and Whole House, suffrage, Carrie Nation, Ida B. Wells, the anti-lynching campaign, tie all of these pieces together. So for my students, and I always refer to them as student historians, some of the questions that I would ask throughout this time period is looking at how do the historical interpretations differ, how do they advocate for keeping the Gilded Age name? Oh, did everyone lose audio? I see someone just lost audio.
I think it's just Pamela, and I heard a click on the phone, so she might have been on the phone, so I just put a note in for her to call back in.
Okay, good. Just making sure. Still on audio there. And so really at the end of the unit, I bring up the same questions that I asked them at the beginning. Is that, are these distinct eras between Gilded Age and Progressive? Why I have them try and think about why would I connect it with this larger rise of industrial America umbrella. And then I ask them, what would they name the historical era? So what do they consider the beginning year and event? What do they consider the ending year and event? So it really gets them to have really good kind of historiographical conversations, but doing it this way feels a little less stressful to them than if they're writing a formal essay or a research paper, when they're looking at kind of, what do I name a period? What's this beginning event? How do I know? So I get really excited about adding in more historiographical pieces, and I really think that it fits so well with what Peter and Crystal are doing with those fantastic kind of creativity within the history that they have, and so I love being able to kind of connect these pieces together. So there we have from me. Carolyn, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Great, thank you. So we've heard three very distinct approaches from seasoned, highly skilled teachers who happen also to be a lot of fun to work with. And just take a deep breath here. All presenters, if you look through the chat box, I'm going to take about another 5 minutes to wind this up, and then we can open it up to any other conversation. So thank you, Crystal, Peter, and Bonnie. All right, so back to the website where you will find the resources that we've been showcasing, and also many others, thousands of others as a matter of fact. Again, it's free. The URL is pbslearningmedia.org. It's for K-12, all subjects, very strong in social studies, to a large part because we are drawing on American experience. We're also drawing on frontline, and we hear from social studies teachers all the time that they love teaching with frontline. So you will find clips from Frontline Broadcast as well as American Experience. I also threw Nova in there also. Interactive lessons you will find on PBS Learning Media. They're a different kind of animal than you might be familiar with. Sometimes we refer to them as self-paced modules. They are fully flushed out lessons that the student is one-to-one with the screen. I know Peter has used a lot of the interactive lessons. Imperialism and the Spanish-American War, Louisiana Purchase, challenges of making peace in the Great War. Police reform is an interactive lesson that draws on footage from Frontline. There are, I haven't counted up how many there are for social studies, but we have them for all grades and all subjects, but we have many, many in social studies, so I encourage you to check those out also. And again, just a reminder that the resources from the Gilded Age are drawn from the American Experience broadcast. And I think that you can stream it. Again, I'm going to look up the link to do that. I'll put that in the chat box. And then these are the clips, and I put the links in the chat box. You also have them in that resource document that you can upload at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side. Coming soon. Okay, we're continually putting new resources up on Learning Media, and just a couple of examples drawing from American Experience. There are new resources coming soon, coming from the bombing of Wall Street, and also the series on circus. And then from Frontline, the Facebook, I think it was a 2-night broadcast that they had. There are clips coming from Frontline also that will be up on Learning Media. Okay, we'd love it if you would give us answers to a very, very short survey. Here's the link. I'll put it in the chat box. And I'd like you please to answer by next Monday, and then everyone who answers the survey will send out certificates for attending the webinar this evening. But aside from that, we'd love to get your feedback. We do ask you about what you liked, how we can make these webinars better. We're running a lot of them, and we want to continue to make them more relevant for you and better. So let us know your thoughts about that. And last but not least, this is my contact information, Carolyn Jacobs, Carolyn_Jacobs at WGBH.org. I am really a teacher contact person, so if you email me with any questions you have, I can direct them to the right people. If you'd like to contact presenters or make sure you get on our mailing list, the best way to do that is to simply register on PBS Learning Media. Sign up. Again, it's free, and we use that list of people who've registered often for emailing out invitations to webinars such as this. All right, so we still have a couple of minutes if we want to take advantage of it, or you're welcome to say goodnight and go have your glass of wine or cup of tea and end your evening. Presenters, Crystal, do you have any thoughts or anything you've noticed in the chat box you want to point out? And if not, Bonnie and Peter, anybody who'd like to speak?
I know I think I've been trying to follow up on all the comments that have